Welcome, dear listeners, to another episode of Music and Politics, the only fusion show on the internet where we listen to music and think philosophically about politics. Every episode we turn to music to listen and analyze as a dimension of politics, to music as a political text, from tone poems to tropicalia, from gospel to grunge, and opera to hip-hop. From Thailand to Tallinn, from Soweto to Surabaya, and from Mumbai to Mobile, we traverse the world. And we guarantee, before you leave us today, you will have your eardrums a-tingle and your brain cells a-quiver with something new and unexpected you won't forget anytime soon. And please remember to rate and review and to like and subscribe to Music and Politics, and to support us on Patreon at Music and Politics Pod, one word. Any help at all is so very appreciated. It will keep us going, and in return, we pledge our personal attention and support to you in your learning. Happy and bold listening ahead. Welcome, dear listeners. Great to have you back with us for another episode of Music and Politics, Music Matters. Today, a lecture that we offer to you in its entirety, which will be bookended by two full recordings, historical recordings, pre-war recordings, one of the B minor Mass by the Berlin Philharmonic Choir, and the other a Bach aria by the contralto Paula Salomon-Lindberg, who was a protege of the conductor Siegfried, who with the Berlin Philharmonic Choir actually undertook the first complete recording on shellac disc in history of Bach's St. Matthew Passion. And the topic of today's lecture has to do with Bach, care for Bach, the Bach revival, Bach and the Jews, Bach in Berlin, even Bach into the synagogues themselves, and as by way of introduction, to offer you some little more background and context before the lecture itself begins. That also carries forward into the Wagner-Brahms split, the Wagner-Meyerbeer controversy. So we really have as our focus today perhaps the greatest composer of the 18th century, Bach, and perhaps the at least most performed or most popular opera composer of the 19th century, today largely forgotten, Giacomo Meyerbeer. As Glen Gould once observed, Bach had little impact in his own time, and certainly not outside of his native region of provincial Saxony. When speaking of Bach, therefore, one must inevitably grapple with the phenomenon of revival. It was Adoph Marx who referred to Bach as a, quote, temple long shut down. It is a point of musical historical fact that much of Bach's oeuvre, from the Passions to the cantatas, entered widespread circulation only belatedly, decades after the composer's own lifetime, and only due to the efforts of others. Conspicuous amongst these others were German Jews, specifically based in Berlin. Felix Mendelssohn's 1829 Berlin, quote, premiere of the St. Matthew Passion at the Singakademie looms particularly large in legend. For some, it formed the basis not only of the specific German cultural attachment to music, but even the establishment of music as having a distinctly public and ethical function. And we carry on. Bach, as a source of shoring up belief in belief, is particularly critical in the German context, where the chain of transmission amongst composers was notoriously vexed and contested. At the outset, I would like to make use of the intellectual brace offered by the Marxist Messianist cultural critic Walter Benjamin, namely his notion of secular priesthood. Benjamin himself embodied this concept, as did the activist to be discussed in the lecture following this introduction. He advised that poets and artists of the productivity-obsessed bourgeois epoch, as first developed in 19th century Paris, had to grapple with a new conception of work distinct from the feudal idea of leisure, formerly linked to creative endeavors. Benjamin held that those most comfortable in their own skin as artists were those who most closely resembled secular priests. He sought to draw a contrast to modern artists who rushed into mass entertainment, the avant-garde, or who cultivated a proletarian ethos aimed at the most unfortunate, of course. Within this analysis, the activists of Care for Bach fit in neatly. They were modern without being avant-garde, collectivist while not proletarian, and edifying rather than distracting. Devotion to Bach provided a cultural highway to navigate around distinctly modern and potentially hazardous turnoffs. Furthermore, it has almost become a platitude to suggest that the oeuvre of Bach is among the best proofs for the existence of an omniscient deity. In this sense, Bach functions in ways distinct from all other composers. This has become something of a standalone discourse and subject in the English-speaking world. To name one example, the biologist Lewis Thomas, in response to questions about which music be aboard the Voyager spacecraft, suggested that sending the complete works of Bach to extraterrestrials, to aliens, would be boasting. These figures here were well ahead of their time in illustrating an attraction to Bach based on the power of persuasive belief itself, and not one specifically or exclusively denominationally Christian. Belief itself is especially pertinent in the German Jewish context, where the hope for integration and ultimately even survival itself required an inordinate amount of belief in one's external reality, one that was tragically, in the end, misplaced. All of the figures to be discussed here stood within the shadow of Felix Mendelssohn's grandfather Moses, a philosopher of the Enlightenment renowned for his efforts to harmonize reason and revelation. An atheistically inclined cultural practice that sought to uphold secularism of either the French or the Anglo variety had very little place in Berlin and in Germany. One might also ponder how the lack of such a strong secularist tradition provided little counterweight to the advent of modern political fanaticism. This distinct aspect of revival with respect to Bach's music meant the transformation of something putatively antiquated into something ever renewing. A more fitting metaphor in music for processes at work in Jewish life, including modernization, reform, could hardly be in the offing. Bach, therefore, like Judaism itself in the gaze of the Christian world, formed something like an Old Testament. And the embrace of the music of Bach reflects a acceptance of the suspension of the law and its replacement by the experience of divine grace. Please enjoy. Don't forget to like and subscribe and leave some comments. Thank you and fare thee all so well.
Oh,
The first half of this talk is that of a critical meta-reception aimed at a contemporary context regarding the composer Giacomo Meyerbeer, and is therefore an instance of cultural criticism. The second half of what follows is a consideration and meditation on the historical reception within Berlin Jewish circles of the works of Johann Sebastian Bach in the generations after Moses and Felix Mendelssohn, and is thus a case of cultural history. Secular priests and the reform of reform, from Meyerbeer to Bach into the synagogues. Secular priests here is meant to be understood as one modality of cultural action, representation, and mediation, as suggested by Walter Benjamin. Namely that intellectuals and artists serve as mediating guides, even as bearers of hidden truths, as they may in fact be detectives of the soul, whose instruments are narrative and myth. I take both cases to be discussed here as emblematic of secular priesthood. First, the 19th century German Jewish composer Giacomo Meyerbeer, once the most performed opera composer of the 19th century, now almost forgotten, and the Bach revival circle in the generations after Felix Mendelssohn, which is to say from the 1880s through to the 1930s, namely Siegfried Ochs, Dr. Kurt Singer, and Paula Salomon-Lindberg, and their institutions, the Berlin Philharmonic Choir, the Berlin Doctors Choir, and the Jüdische Kulturbund. Though all were acting in the putatively secular civic space of the concert hall, the displacement of religious energies into their art barely and rarely lies much beneath the surface. Reform of reform is in contrast a conceptual adage, even mantra, of the religious existentialist philosopher Franz Rosenzweig, which speaks to the ongoing need to reimagine and revise the reformation of religion, that confessionalization, privatization, and rationalization, as modeled by Protestantism, and then adapted and internalized by German Jewish reform in the 19th century. In a strikingly different and later context in the United States, this would come to be known as renewal, as a means toward spiritual rejuvenation after the tumult of the 1960s. For Rosenzweig, the focus was on restoring the primacy of the philosophical meaning of revelation and of being itself, while curbing the tyranny of any Hegelian historicist logic of development. His controversial philosophical contemporary Oswald Spengler pithily formulated it thus: the, quote, mighty piety of the secondary religiousness, wherein, quote, holy still being reappear. In Freudian terms, this would amount to a, quote, secondary revision, an attempt to reshape the illogical into something more coherent. Or one may also consider it as an act of desublimation, as a means to set back free energies which had been solidified to the point of reification. So while philosophically, reform of reform is all about rupture, discontinuity, and revision, secular priests, especially with respect to Bach and music, is strikingly continuous and consistent. So despite the break with both Kant and Hegel, Rosenzweig's musical penchant for Bach allows an understanding of German Jewish habitus as a continuous musical phenomenon, one of ongoing sustenance, not double liminality, when understood musically. Hovering over both halves of this discussion is the baleful spirit of Richard Wagner, in particular his extremely powerful and long-lasting discourse of cultural anti-Semitism, in particular the claim made in his racist screed Judentum in der Musik, Judaism in Music, published first anonymously in 1850 and then reprinted under his own name in 1869, that Jews can only mimic, not create, and that they do not contribute, but rather degrade. The two primary targets of his ire were fellow German-born composers, Mendelssohn, the first generator of the Bach revival, and the selfsame Meyerbeer, both of whom provided ineluctable models for Wagner, with the second even supplying critical aid and mentorship during a crisis of professional despair in Paris in 1839. Wagner's legacy is one of indelible scarring over both composers. Mendelssohn, though still beloved worldwide, never fully shook the Wagnerian stain of the light, even superficial, while the case of Meyerbeer presents one of professional assassination, near unparalleled in cultural history. These savage attacks were both Oedipal and seething with resentful ingratitude. Wagner, who displaced his revolutionary impulses into the world of fantasy, sought to devour his professional parents. In the case of Meyerbeer, it would be little an exaggeration to claim that this is the operatic equivalent of never knowing that the Beatles had once existed in the pop idiom, as has the plot of the recent film Yesterday. To provide just one example, as the data analysis necessary for this evidentiary claim remains a work in progress, nearly all of Germany's world top 80 opera houses have at least one Wagner opera in their repertory, whilst only one or two have had a Meyerbeer opera firmly in the Spielplan. The Deutsche Oper of Berlin has, however, recently had a laudatory plan to produce all of Meyerbeer's operas in a cycle. To paraphrase Max Horkheimer, who once claimed that they who would speak of fascism must not remain silent about capitalism, they who would speak of Wagner must not continue the silence regarding Meyerbeer. It was Meyerbeer, after all, who provided the grand operatic model and template for Wagner that he sought to emulate and ultimately replace. Wagner's hate-filled resentment may rightly be seen as an early purveyor of modern fanaticism. Especially appropriate, then, is that the overarching theme of Wagner's mentor cum nemesis, Giacomo Meyerbeer, was precisely that of fanaticism. If one had to draw a red line through most of Meyerbeer's operas, all of them, unlike those mythic of Wagner, were real-world and historical. Les Huguenots of 1836, about the persecution of religious minorities, Le Prophète, about a fanatical Christian sectarian leader of 1849, and L'Africaine, about mission-possessed European colonizers of 1865. In each, his overriding concern was fanaticism and its dangers, especially those tied to religion and myth. Meyerbeer remained steadfast tied to the French Revolutionary critique of religion, attuned to the dangers when obsession overtakes reason. Though entirely German in his family background, Meyerbeer, unlike Wagner, eschewed any nationalistic tie, and instead fully embraced his adopted country of France as the European home of the Declaration of the Rights of Man, Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité. What one might call an original, quote, old atheist, Meyerbeer fused Enlightenment skepticism with grand spectacle, bringing to its apogee the five-act structure with its ballet interludes and athletic singing arias that Wagner discarded as outmoded and undramatic. It is a supreme irony that although Wagner based his whole project on making opera more dramatic, Meyerbeer's works are consistently much more fast-paced and action-filled than anything by Wagner. Without Meyerbeer's example, Wagner couldn't have developed his comprehensive project, the Gesamtkunstwerk, total work of art, and his Zukunftsmusik, music of the future, designed to counter Meyerbeer's formal example. Meyerbeer's method was empirical and documentary, carefully unfolding and reproducing historical developments so that audiences could observe and learn. He was able to transform opera into a consciousness-raising classroom and a platform for historical witnessing. Most memorable is the chilling conspiracy scene 3 in Act 4 of Les Huguenots of 1836 that follows step by step the methodical plan to massacre and expel French Protestants. Though the word genocide had yet to be coined, this scene still remains the most adequate and alert rendering of this terrible phenomenon on the operatic stage. The Catholic nobleman and governor Count of Saint-Brie sings of, quote, annihilating enemies, that every Huguenot shall fall, and of inspiration to slay them from the land. He rounds out the end of the scene by delivering precise instructions for when, where, and how to conduct this mass slaughter. Chilling and unadorned, Meyerbeer lays out these facts to witness without dramatic distortion. Meyerbeer's final work for the operatic stage, his 1865 L'Africaine, is his parting message to the world, and it remains a landmark in music history. A century and a half later, and there is still hardly any work of opera that features a black female as its hero and protagonist, as this work does. Aimed at far into the future, Meyerbeer crowds quite a lot in. It is a clear story of the colonial encounter, of Europeans crashing into the global south. Vasco da Gama himself is a main character that is the ultimate personage of the age of exploration. Yet also featured in here is the Catholic Inquisition, an institution that followed closely on the heels of European expansion. From Goa in India, where, by the way, the Jewish community of Cochin Kerala began as refugees therefrom, to Macau in China. The country Europeans land upon is depicted as a full-fledged state, royal, African, but also Hindu. Meyerbeer's presentation of the colonial encounter is once again clear and methodical. The audience observes a queen addressed as a, quote, slave by Europeans. Her defiant adjutant reminds her, quote, remember, though thou now were a tyrant's fetters, thou nonetheless a queen. Anticipating post-colonial thinkers like Fanon, Meyerbeer frames the African queen as a, quote, phobogenic object that elicits anxiety. In his proud and self-confident depiction of the African queen, Meyerbeer demonstrates a psychological truth that the very notion of a, quote, black person with all its projected inferiority is itself a construct of the white gaze. On the one hand, we observe the degradation of the noble queen, and on the other, the sense of entitlement and ownership of Europeans. Quote, O new world, thou art mine, to me thou dost belong. Quote, and elsewhere in the libretto, quote, yes, land till now unknown, thought mine, mine, yes, mine. Unmistakable and direct, when at the end Europeans finally depart, the indigenous celebrate, quote, O boundless joy, at length they're gone, forever gone. Meyerbeer directs the operatic spotlight to colonialism and imperialism, just as these phenomena were reaching their apogee. He aids his audience in imagining this experience from the internal psychological reality of those on the receiving end. It is most difficult to avoid that in both cases, Huguenot and L'Africaine, the subtext is that Meyerbeer is talking about Europe's Jews, those east of France in particular, experiencing their own version of colonial subjugation. If Wagner engages in fantasy and fanatical emotions, Meyerbeer's art form is one of pedagogy and empathy. This Wagner-Meyerbeer musical relationship is akin to an operatic civil war over the legacies of the Enlightenment. But now, today, is about the meaning of the German Jewish legacy and Vergangenheitsbewältigung, or coming to terms with the past. One way forward for a genuine Aufarbeitung, or working through, is to borrow a concept from the French situationists, détournement, a détournement of the Bayreuth Festival itself, a repurposing alteration, and a replacement of the repertoire of all of Wagner's works with those of Meyerbeer in that yearly festival where even today German chancellors proudly visit. As we continue on from Wagner, Meyerbeer onto Bach, we must ask then how Bach figured so central and in such a continuous fashion, and even functioned as a kind of counter-Wagner, so that even a renegade thinker like Rosenzweig called the winning over of Bach's vocal music for the synagogue an old favorite idea of his. After all, it has been well established that Bach's musical world is indivisible with anti-Judaic associations. Nevertheless, numerous Jewish thinkers, from Moses to Felix Mendelssohn to Siegfried Ochs and finally Dr. Kurt Singer, argued for the viability of Bach. As is well known, the Bach revival is largely attributed to Felix Mendelssohn, especially to his full-scale performance of the St. Matthew Passion at the Sing Academy in Berlin in 1829. Much less well known, however, is Siegfried Ochs' first full-scale performance of the B minor Mass in Berlin in 1895. So dramatic was its effect that the writer Arnold Zweig, 20 years later, during World War I, wrote of the need for the work to be remounted during the fighting on behalf of the troops. Also passed over in the generation after Felix Mendelssohn was that it was the same Ochs who actually released the very first shellac disc recording of the St. Matthew Passion in 1928. And such was his parting message to the world as he passed away just 1 year later in 1929. Ochs' devotion to Bach was such that he studiously avoided many of the classics of the choral repertoire, so that the Berlin Philharmonic Choir, which he founded in 1882, never performed either the Mozart or the Verdi Requiem or any of Handel's many oratorios. Kurt Singer, writing in the only monograph still existing regarding Ochs, frames this compulsive returning drive to Bach as a function of the void left by Wagner, whether due to his immense influence or toxic fallout, or both. In Singer's book on Ochs, he wrote, "Aber ein neuer Wagner kam nicht, und einen Bach, den oft den allermodernsten nannte, galt es immer wieder neu zu entdecken." Quote, "But a new Wagner never arrived, and so this Bach, whom Ochs named the most modern of all, could always be discovered anew." Chief among these efforts of rediscovery, we might also say reform of reform, was Ochs' almost wholesale revival of the cantatas of Bach. After having almost never been performed outside of Bach's base in Leipzig, between 1900 and 1928, Ochs led his chorus in 146 different performances of 26 of Bach's cantatas. If we are to believe Singer, he literally restored these songs to the repertoire, which had previously gone almost entirely unknown. Philosophically, Bach's vocal works provide one of the few available bridges, musically or otherwise, between the historically realized ecclesia of Christendom and a Judaism that exists outside of history, but inside the eternal time of redemption, to use the categories of Rosenzweig. These mass choral performances in any era, regardless of context, are an entire breakdown of any strict separation of concert and church. They are a form of reform, certainly including the earlier Mendelssohn performances, where in many cases the singing is less about the performers than the ingathering of community. Even the possession of healing properties, whether bioharmony or the musical yoga of cardiac synchronization. This was all made explicit by Dr. Kurt Singer with his Weimar-era doctors' choir that performed in hospitals, jails, on behalf of widows, war-wounded, and the unemployed. Singer remained a scholarly devotee of Bach's cantatas, completing a tome on the subject, which he attempted to translate into English while hiding from the Nazis in Amsterdam on behalf of an emergency non-quota U.S. visa, which never arrived. There are also some notable biographical parallels between the much more well-known Rosenzweig and the overlooked Dr. Singer. Both shared an angst over the decline, even an anxiety over the evaporation of spiritual energy, and the onset of cultural desiccation. Interestingly, their counter-atheism and dissent from Kantian rationalism both found an expression in a suspicion of academicism, despite their scholarly endeavors. Both served in the Great War and were intimately confronted with trauma and the subsequent need for some sort of cultural rebirth. Both Singer's Doctors' Choir in Berlin and Rosenzweig's Freies Jüdisches Lehrhaus in Frankfurt may be seen as a form of civic engagement beyond the boundaries of thought and into institution building. Both may be seen as projects of healing under the shadow of disease. Rosenzweig was already diagnosed with ALS in 1922, the disease that would bring about his premature death a few years later, and one might say that Singer's disease was Nazism. His choir would go on to form the core of the Jüdische Kulturbund after the Nazi takeover in 1933, and he himself would perish in Theresienstadt in February of 1944. Finally, the key text that links the two is Singer's address entitled Psalmentext in J.S. Bach's Kantatenwerk, the text of the Psalms in Bach's cantatas, dedicated to Rabbi Leo Beck on the 25th year jubilee of his position as rabbi in Berlin on the 28th of December, 1937. Therein, Singer elaborated a number of formal suggestions for the organization of this liturgy for the synagogue, as Rosenzweig had once proposed. The inclusion of Bach would upend and revamp the entire order of liberal Judaic service. Express curation would be necessary, he explains, with a mix of musical and textual components from various cantatas, much as Bach once did himself. For him, Bach's musical language had the quality of Überparteilichkeit, ecumenicism that went beyond the confessional difference between or among various Christian or Jewish factions. Consistent throughout is Singer's dedication to the solemn and the pastoral, to unlock that ennobling quality of devotion that even Moses Mendelssohn had once identified as well. Singer, for instance, describes the melody of Cantata 6, Bleib bei uns, denn es will Abend werden. Stay with us as evening falls, as coming down from heaven and, quote, enclosing the heart with divine wonder. Though originally composed for the second day of Easter, he deems it ideal for the entry of the Sabbath. The title of this cantata reflects Singer's main motivating concern, providing existential comfort. In conclusion, I would like to acknowledge the valuable insight of the recently deceased Professor Judith Cohen of the Hebrew University, whose own father, Benno Cohen, was an important Kulturbund leader and one of the few witnesses from Berlin who testified at the Eichmann trial. I would second her claim that Singer's advocacy of Bach is a repost to fellow Kulturbund activists with Zionist convictions who argued for the primacy of the Jewish identity of cultural creators over the substance and content of cultural works. Singer counters the adoption of such logic by rival Kulturbund leaders that sought to restrict cultural materials in a Jewish context to only those created by Jews, and thus he carries high the Mendelssohn banner until the bitter end. The impulse here, as shared with Rosenzweig, is to counteract the emergence of folkish ideology among fellow Jews as a differing form of counter-Nazi riposte. It represents nothing less than a devotion to the modern counter-tradition unveiled and pursued by Moses Mendelssohn, a striking continuity. As a subtle text of resistance against the Nazis, one might say Singer's address represents a Judaic upholding of an originally German Protestant tradition of worldly asceticism and piety long since abandoned by the Nazis. A final parting détournement for our own time today is to imagine one more creative and critical displacement, or détournement, in the secular priestly spirit of Meyerbeer to Rosenzweig Singer. Why not bring Qawwali or Sufi devotional singing out of the mosque into the mass today, and where else more logically to begin than in Bavaria's wonderful Baroque churches, a sign, if not of redemption, then at least of greater intercultural understanding. that about does it for us. We hope you enjoyed the show. Thank you for tuning in, our dear listeners. Please remember to rate and review and to like and subscribe to Music and Politics, the only show on the internet that combines musical grooves with philosophical insights from all around the world. Please do send any questions, thoughts, comments, and suggestions to musicandpoliticspod@gmail.com. That's one word lowercase, musicandpoliticspod. And please do find us out on Patreon. Again, at musicandpoliticspod, one word lowercase. There you can support us to keep us going, to see another day. And in exchange for the cost of an overpriced cup of coffee, we will provide curated readings and playlists from what you have already heard and where you can go next on your own journey into music and politics. Fare thee all so well.